Just days after taking office, Australia's newly elected Prime Minister wasted no time resetting the country's engagement and agenda with regional neighbours. Anthony Albanese prioritised his first bilateral visit to Indonesia. Jason Dacey discussed the significance of that very clear signal with Griffith University's Dr. Anne Cullen.
I think it's probably better to see this in historical terms. Australia's relationship with Indonesia expands way back into history and predates European occupation. Indonesia Makassans were our first traders with our First Nations peoples. So this is a reaffirmation that we're seeing and a very important public conversation about our relationship with Indonesia, and it's reaffirming those ties and reaffirming that we want to all be good neighbours. And that, to me, is a very optimistic way forward.
How fractured had the relationship between the two countries become in recent years?
I'm not sure that the relationship was fractured. There's a lot of diplomacy that happens and occurs behind the scenes that isn't necessarily part of our public conversation. And that work was still continuing. It was happening very productively. And we saw Australia and Indonesia progressing through, especially the last few years with COVID, some really tricky times, and continuing that very close relationship we have as neighbours. So fractured, I think, is a bit strong. But what is rewarding is that we are turning that public conversation into something really positive and thinking about Australia's location, Australia's positioning in Asia, and who we have as neighbours. And that's really reassuring.
How significant will strong collaboration between Australia and Indonesia be in the context of growing geopolitical instability across the Pacific?
Instability is such a big word. It's just not about geostrategic issues. It's also about climate, sustainable energy. It's about food security, water security, all of these different securities. And we share so many common elements with Indonesia in those securities. So it's just not the one, but rather the expanded conversation, I think, that is we saw being referenced in that joint communique. And that joint communique, of course, is the solid reaffirmation of close relationships. And it's also a promise of moving forward together to address our shared concerns.
Indonesia, like many nations in the region, faces significant challenges in its journey toward net zero emissions, with a population of more than 270 million, growing by 10% every year. The $200 million climate and infrastructure partnership in the joint communique between the two nations would appear to be a strategic play for Australian innovation in renewables to enter this potentially massive marketplace for energy transition.
Absolutely. I think Australia has a lot to offer in this area, and we have a lot of expertise. Unfortunately, there was that little problem of COVID got in the way of that continued cooperation on renewable energies, finding innovations that work for both nations. And here we go. We're in recovery mode post-COVID and ready to restart that cooperation. And that's going to be for the benefit of both countries, not just Australian expertise going to Indonesia, but also Indonesian expertise being shared back into Australia as well.
Australia's green credentials were also highlighted, weren't they, when it comes to offering support and advice for the planning of the new capital, Nusantara. Does this again reveal what the Australian government is targeting as key growth sectors for future exports?
Absolutely. And I think a recognition of the grand ambition of this new Nusantara capital city being relocated into Kalimantan is a huge undertaking. And there is, we certainly have experience with creating a capital with Canberra. And we have lots to offer in ways of, sharing ideas about how to get those green credentials operational in the new capital city for Indonesia.
How will the rapidly growing Indonesian economy, predominantly its middle class, translate into increasing influence for Asia Pacific's most populous country over the next 2 decades?
Oh, this is my pet baby subject. By 2030, Indonesia will have 44 million middle-class households. How many Australias fit into just that one statistic? And so, yes, absolutely, it makes complete common sense that the economic rise of Indonesia in the very near future will see opportunities for Australian business to engage with this neighbour, to be deeply involved. And that requires relationship building, authentic relationships, not just an invoice signature relationship. All of those business behaviours and cultures we know exist in Asia. We need to continue to develop in Australia, and we continue to reappraise where Australia is in our relationship with Indonesia and Asia, because we are a very different country today than we were last century. And personal relationships in business, in Asia, in Indonesia now are far more plentiful.
Given the growth that's coming, Indonesia's food demand is expected to quadruple by 2050, for example. Do you anticipate that the Indonesia-Australia Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement will become one of Australia's most important trade deals in the decades ahead?
I think it's vital. I think it's absolutely fundamental to Australia's success, not with lettuces at $10 a head, but when, we are recovered from all of these, natural disasters. Things like food security are fundamental to Indonesians as they are fundamental to Australians. And while we've seen food hikes, we haven't truly seen food insecurity. Indonesia's exactly the same way. They want to make sure they don't see it either. So those trade deals facilitate good common sense trading relationships that we can build upon. We're seeing it occur again in that public conversation now more than we've seen it previously, even though it would have been occurring.